Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone again to today's webinar. We're looking today at federal sponsor, other support, and international engagements, and hopefully giving you some more information on what you need to know, or potentially reinforcing things you already do know. I'm David Mulder. I am the Assistant Director of Regulatory Affairs in the medical school, specifically focused on conflicts of interest and outside interests. And prior to my current role, I was the program manager for international engagement and research security in ORSP, which is where I first became acquainted with this topic. April?
Hi, everyone. I'm April Pepperdine. I'm the director of our UMOR Conflict of Interest program. We have oversight again for conflicts of interest, institutional, individual, as well as a new arm of our program of international engagement type reviews. I am David's counterpart on campus. So thanks so much for joining us.
All right, next slide, please. Okay, just to set the agenda for what we're going to be covering today, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the background on this topic to try to provide a little bit more context. We are going to talk a little bit about M-informed disclosures because there's a lot of overlap with M-informed disclosures in this area. We'll be talking about biosketches, other support. Then we will be running through some scenarios to let you all provide your opinions and thoughts on some situations that might arise. We'll talk a little bit about how research administrators can help, what to expect from your colleagues in the central offices. We'll talk a little bit about NIH foreign components. Then we'll switch gears and talk some about non-NIH sponsors like NSF, DOD, Department of Energy, et cetera. A little bit about what we see coming down the pike in terms of the future for this topic. And then, of course, we'll talk about what kinds of help and resources are available out there. Next slide, please. So just to provide a little bit more context on this topic, part of the confusion that arises stems from the information that investigators have to provide in multiple locations, depending on the purpose and depending on the requirement. So investigators are entering information about their outside activities in M-Inform. They're also providing information in their Biosketch and then in their other support. And when we say other support in this webinar, we are using that term to encompass any type of sponsor documentation requirement related to an investigator's sources of support. So NIH refers to it as other support. NSF refers to it as current and pending. But when we say other support here today, we mean any of those types of documents. But the thing that we want to stress is even though that there are different data elements going into these different locations and they are serving different purposes, there is a lot of overlap. And really the most important thing that we want to stress is that there needs to be congruency across these different locations in those instances where they do overlap. Next slide, please. All right, so just a little bit more background and context on this topic. As most folks are probably aware, there's been a lot of increased scrutiny from our federal sponsors in regard to investigators' sources of support, their institutional affiliations, and their international collaborations. And as a result of that increased scrutiny, there have also been additional policies and heightened expectations, both for investigators and for recipient institutions like the University of Michigan. And this heightened level of scrutiny and concern really goes back a number of years now. I would say actually more to like 2014 or so. But the first real compelling instance that came up for the University of Michigan and other recipient institutions was back in July of 2019, when the NIH first reminded institutions of what their expectations are regarding foreign components and other support. And I use virtual air quotes around reminded there because the reality is that most recipient institutions found the expectations that NIH outlined at that point in time to really be new requirements more than reminders of existing requirements. Regardless of that interpretation, back about a year ago now, NIH did implement actual new requirements for the biosketches and other support. And initially they had intended those requirements to go live, I think it was in May of 2021. And then they luckily decided to delay the implementation of some of the more onerous of those requirements until just this past January. So January 25th, 2022 is when NIH's new requirements went into effect. And along the way, other sponsor agencies have also been updating their requirements and providing additional information about their expectations around documents like biosketches and other support, but they haven't had so many of those kind of point in time deadlines like NIH issued for January 25th of this year. Next slide, please.
So switching gears just a little bit to what U of M requires specifically as far as disclosing activities external to U of M. So these are outside activities that an investigator may have that could be somehow related to an investigator's U of M responsibilities. So these outside activities are disclosed in M-Inform, our central disclosure system. Investigators involved in NIH-sponsored activities, whether it's current or future, are required to upload supporting documentation for international activities in M-Inform. So that was a new requirement as of July of last year. They need to include both the original and English translation, if that's necessary. And examples of that documentation include contracts, written agreements, research proposals, etc. Just a reminder, research administrators are not responsible for M-Inform disclosures. However, you can remind your investigators that they might be able to find a contract or supporting documentation that they uploaded that they also need to provide to a federal sponsor here as well, such as NIH. Next slide, please.
Sorry. So just digging into a little bit more detail on the biosketch, some of the changes that April alluded to. The template for biosketches for NIH has changed, including the actual format. So one of the first things that you can do to help is to make sure that investigators are using the most up-to-date version. In terms of the format, the biggest change is in section B, which asks for all position scientific appointments in honors listed in reverse chronological order. And that is a change from the previous biosketch format. And in their updated instructions and guidance, NIH has reminded everyone that they expect to see all current positions and scientific appointments, whether those are domestic or foreign, whether they stress that they need to, we need to include any affiliations with entities or governments outside of the US. It includes any titled academic, professional, or institutional appointments. It doesn't matter whether or not the investigator is receiving payment for that position or title or affiliation, and it doesn't matter whether it's full-time, part-time, or voluntary. So it could be something like an adjunct appointment, visiting position, or honorary. NIH still wants to know about them. And we just want to remind folks that one option that you might want to consider is to use the Science CV tool, which is managed by NSF, and that is an option that's available. And I believe there is an existing Navigate webinar that provides more information as well on how to use the Science CV tool. Next slide, please.
So when we talk about other support, just wanting to make sure that everybody is aware, this includes any resources available to support any of an investigator's research endeavors. This includes all active and pending sources of other support, and the NIH now requires two particular sections in their other support document, one for projects and proposals and another for in-kind non-financial resources. Next slide, please. So speaking of projects and proposals, that could include U of M projects, including those routed through ORSP, internally funded projects, et cetera. Projects that are not routed through U of M are conducted as part of a non-U of M appointment. So this includes formal external consulting agreements that involves the design, conduct, or reporting of research. But beyond that, if one of our investigators is listed on another institution's research project that they may be doing outside of their U of M role, that does need to be included in OtherSupport. These examples include work that may result in publication in an academic journal, designing a protocol, data analysis, serving on a steering committee for a clinical trial. Next slide, please. So when we talk about in-kind support, we have specific criteria that in-kind support must meet in order to be included in OtherSupport. So I'm sure these slides will be available afterward, and you can go to our website and see that, or ORSP's website, and look at that criteria. But a friendly reminder that in-kind resources can be a person, place, or thing. So, personnel, I think, is the most recent clarification that NIH has made, that if they are visiting scholars, visiting students, supported by a non-U of M entity, but are working on the investigator's research while at U of M, they should be included as an in-kind resource. In addition, space such as office space, lab space, equipment, materials, and supplies would need to be included as in-kind support. Thank you. So disclosing in-kind non-monetary resources that meet all of the following that are not publicly or widely available, were or will be provided by a non-U of M entity, either domestic or foreign, and were provided in the past 3 years. So I mentioned the criteria on the previous slide, and this is essentially what that is, just so that you're aware. In-kind resources intended for use on the proposed project should be included as part of the facilities and other resources or equipment sections of the application, and not necessarily in OtherSupport. So, these are really talking about resources that are uniquely available to a researcher being reported in OtherSupport.
April, before you move on, there are a couple of questions that have come in through the chat that I think would be helpful to address now. The first one is, do we need to include an in-kind section if there is no in-kind support? I would say yes, still include the in-kind section and just state that there is none to list, just to avoid any confusion on the sponsor's part, that it's not that something was omitted, it's that there is actually nothing to report. And then the second question is, how does the other support for RPPRs differ from one used for proposals? And I hate to say this, but I'm going to say, wait until we have, well, don't wait to submit, but before we provide additional guidance, we need to clarify that NIH's own instructions on that part are very confusing and in fact contradictory in some ways. And in addition, some of the feedback that we've gotten from personnel at NIH has been in conflict with what some of their own guidance says. So more to come on the topic of RPPRs.
And we'll refer you to the bottom of the slides. You are more than welcome to reach out and contact us at other.support.questions@umich.edu for any questions that you might have, and we'll walk through the particular situation with you. Usually the answer is it depends. Okay, so talking about formatting, so the revised NIH OtherSupport format does not include some separate sections that were included on a previous U of M format template that we had provided back in late 2019, early 2020. So those sections are foreign components, foreign appointments and affiliations, foreign collaborations, and visitors. Now, that's not to say that some of this information actually may need to be included as part of an individual entry for a project or proposal or an in-kind resource. So, if any of those project or proposals happen to be related to one of an outside appointment or affiliation, et cetera, it should be noted within that entry. Next slide, please. So we mentioned supporting documentations earlier, but for sources of other support that are not routed through U of M and are with an entity outside of the US, investigators now have to provide supporting documentation. So this is limited currently to NIH, though anything could happen in the future where other federal agencies may require it. Documents, again, should be submitted in their original language and, if applicable, in English translation as well. We mentioned, examples of these include grants, contracts, or other agreements specific to appointments, affiliations, or employment with an institution or entity outside the US. And keeping in mind the previous slide about the sections that we either need to include or not any longer, if it is included in other support, then a supporting document would need to be attached. So, of course, appointments need to be included in the Biosketch. However, we're not providing supporting documentation for a Biosketch. These can be machine translated copies. Google Translate is acceptable. And then, as a reminder, NIH investigators can refer to the M-Inform disclosures for copies of their particular contracts. And we're always happy to help figure out where those are and provide those to the investigators as well. Next slide. Thank you. So electronic signatures. NIH is now requiring all investigators to electronically sign their other support document. U of M recommends using the Sign Now e-signature service that includes historical information about that signature should NIH ever need it. A typed name is not a digital signature and it's not acceptable. So Adobe may be okay to use, but not the fill and sign signature piece of that. Also, NIH has clarified that scanned ink signatures or wet signatures are not acceptable unless they're included as part of the digital signature like Sign Now. Sign Now does have an option to upload kind of a picture of a signature. So that is acceptable if it has those, historical trail behind the scenes. Next slide, please.
All right, so now we are going to look at a few different scenarios and give all of you an opportunity to express your thoughts on what does or does not need to be included in other support for each of these. So in these scenarios, we have a hypothetical U of M investigator, Dr. Patel, who might need to include an activity in her other support document for NIH. And in some situations, she may need to provide supporting documents as well. So for each of the scenarios, use the Zoom polling feature to answer the questions that are presented. So next slide, please. All right, so scenario number 1. Dr. Chen from Fudan University in China has written a letter of support for Dr. Patel's R01 renewal. The letter states, "Dear Dr. Patel, I write to confirm my enthusiastic support of your NIH R01 competing grant renewal application entitled Genetic and Molecular Analysis of Abhorrentia Stelaterius. As you know, we recently determined that human cells containing a mutation in the RAD123 line are severely compromised for human HeLa cells and XYZ deficient hamster cells. We look forward to learning the results of your proposed experiments. Indeed, I think your experimental plan provides a logical path forward to test how interactions between RAD123 and BAD321 facilitate cellular retrotransposition. In sum, I find your project exciting and I look forward to our continued interactions and learning the results of your proposed studies. With best regards, Dr. Li Chen." So the question here is, does Dr. Patel need to include Dr. Chen's letter in her other support document? So Laura, if you could provide the first poll. So go ahead and answer the 2 questions. The first one is, Dr. Patel, does Dr. Patel need to include Dr. Chen's letter in her other support document? And then number 2, what if their roles were reversed? So in the reverse situation, obviously, Dr. Patel would be providing a letter of support to Dr. Chen. Just a few more seconds here. Make up your minds. All right. Oh, okay. Gonna end the poll. All right, so a little over half of you said no, she does not. And about 22% said maybe, it depends. 25% or so said yes. And then if the roles were reversed, it's roughly the same proportions. So is anyone, does anyone who said no to the first question, that Dr. Patel does not need to include this in her other support, does anyone want to offer up some additional information on why they said no? Feel free to speak up. You probably have to raise your hand, your virtual hand, using the reactions button. No one's going to be brave? No? Okay. All right. Well, the good news is if you said no, you are correct. Dr. Patel does not need to include this letter of support from Dr. Chen in her other support document. And this is a source of confusion for investigators. Oh, Becky is putting her neck on the line, so to speak. You're on mute, Becky. Okay.
Okay, sorry. So when it said the letter needs to be included in the other support, it's my understanding we only include foreign contracts as hard copy contractual things with the other support. So that's why I said no. And I said yes to the other question because that would infer collaboration with a foreign entity that would have to be disclosed on the other support.
So I understand your rationale there. And for the short answer is no, this would not need to be provided in either case because there is no, it is a gesture of goodwill and intellectual interest. There is no actual support being provided by Dr. Chen toward any of Dr. Patel's research. There's no monetary support, there is no in-kind support being provided, so there is nothing that Dr. Patel needs to include in her other support. If the letter were going the other way, I understand your point, Becky, about it being a foreign collaboration, and we're going to talk about this a little bit more in a few minutes. But merely having an intellectual interest there, again, would not be enough to consider it a foreign component from NIH's sense. But we'll talk a little bit more about sort of the parameters around that in a few minutes.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, next slide, please. All right, scenario number 2, Dr. Patel is the PI on a clinical trial sponsored by Guten Pharma in Germany. The contract can be found by going to award 012345 in ERPM. So the questions are, does Dr. Patel need to include the Guten Pharma trial in her other support document? And if yes, does she need to provide supporting documents to NIH with her other support, meaning an English language copy if it's not in English? Okay, so the overwhelming majority of folks said, yes, Dr. Patel does need to include this in the Guten Pharma trial in her other support document. And you are absolutely correct. She does need to include this. This is a research project that Dr. Patel is actively working on. she needs to include it in her other support. For the second question, whether or not she needs to provide supporting documents to NIH, the answer is actually no, she does not. And the reason for that is because, and it's a little bit of a, I don't want to say a trick question, but because there is an award number, an AWD number in ERPM, we know that this agreement is through U of M, and it's not with Dr. Patel personally. And so because the agreement, the contract for the clinical trial is with U of M, it does not need to be included as a supporting document in Dr. Patel's other support. So yes, the project needs to be included in Dr. Patel's other support document, but she doesn't need to provide a copy of the agreement. All right, next slide, please.
All right. We had somebody raise their hand.
Oh,
Melissa.
yeah, Melissa.
So now I'm confused then. So under what situation would we have a contract with a company that wouldn't be in an award system?
So it wouldn't be U of M that has a contract with the company. It would be the individual investigator that has some sort of outside activity that's related to research or conducting research that needs to be included in other support. And they would have an individual contract outside of U of M. So, back on the supporting document slide, they're only providing other supporting documents or items that are not routed through U of M.
So private consulting is what you're saying. That would be the main situation.
Mostly, they could also be listed as an investigator on a non-US sponsored research project.
Got it. Thank you.
Of course.
Thank you. Great question. All right. Next. Yeah, there we go. Okay. On to Japan. Dr. Patel has a visiting scholar, Dr. Sato, from the University of Tokyo, working in her lab. Dr. Sato is contributing on 2 U of M internally funded research projects that Dr. Patel is currently working on. Dr. Sato is supported 100% by the University of Tokyo. Okay, same questions. First one, does Dr. Patel need to include Dr. Sato on her other support document? And then if yes, does she need to provide some sort of supporting document to NIH with her other support? Going once, twice, 3 times. All right. So again, the vast majority of folks said yes, that Dr. Patel does need to include Dr. Sato as a resource in her other support document, and you are correct. Because Dr. Sato is supporting Dr. Patel's research endeavors, Dr. Sato does need to be listed as a resource in her other support. In this case, she would actually be considered an in-kind resource. Then the second question, if yes, does she need to provide supporting documents to NIH with her other support? The answer is probably no. And this is a very sort of difficult answer to explain, but it really comes down to in the language that NIH uses in the requirements for the other supporting documentation, the supporting documents are required in regard to an investigator's appointment, affiliation, or employment. So U of M's current interpretation of NIH's language is that a supporting document only needs to be included if it is in regard to the U of M an investigator's appointment, affiliation, or employment. So in all likelihood, Dr. Patel would not need to include supporting documents for Dr. Sato unless somehow Dr. Sato's presence in Dr. Patel's lab were the result of a term in some sort of agreement that Dr. Patel has with the University of Tokyo. So if Dr. Patel has if Dr. Patel has, let's say, an honorary appointment with the University of Tokyo, and as part of that agreement, even though she's not being paid, they say, oh, and we're going to send this fabulous researcher, Dr. Sato, to work in your lab for 6 months. Even though it's an honorary appointment, it's a term of that appointment. And in that case, yes, it would need to be included as a supporting document. All right, next slide, please. Okay, Dr. Patel has a consulting agreement with Drogue Fantastique in France. She's overseeing the protocol design of their upcoming clinical trial for a new drug. Same questions. Does Dr. Patel need to include the Drogue Fantastique trial in her other support? And if yes, does she need to provide supporting documents? All right. So again, the majority of folks said yes, and then that it does need to be included in Dr. Patel's other support, and the majority said yes as well to the supporting document. The answer is yes, it does need to be included in Dr. Patel's other support. And then Melissa put in the chat, please clarify whether the agreement is with U of M. And that is exactly the right question to ask. And that was very intentionally left out of the description because the answer to the supporting document question is it depends. If the consulting agreement is with Dr. Patel individually, as April mentioned a minute ago in response to Melissa's question, the other Melissa, Melissa Schoen's question, then yes, it would need to be included. There are situations where our investigators enter into consulting agreements that are routed through U of M. And if that were the case here, then there would not need to be any supporting documentation because the agreement would be with the institution, with U of M, and not with Dr. Patel. So again, if the agreement is with Dr. Patel, it's her own individual consulting effort, then she needs to include a copy of the agreement with her other support document. All right, next slide, please. All right, now in the USA, Dr. Patel has a consulting agreement with Pfizer. She's overseeing the protocol design of their upcoming clinical trial for a new drug. Same questions. Does it need to go in other support? And if yes, does she need to provide supporting documents for that other support to NIH? All right. Got some more diversity of opinion on this one. Not so with the first question, though. Again, a vast majority, 92% said yes, she does need to include it in her other support document. And that is correct. She does need to include this as an activity in her other support document. As to the question of whether she needs to provide supporting documents, there's a lot more difference in opinion this time. Almost evenly split, actually, between yes, no, and it depends. And the answer is no. If the agreement is with a U.S. entity, which in this case we're assuming it is because it's Pfizer and I put an American flag on the slide, then NIH's new requirements for supporting documents do not apply. They only apply to entities outside of the U.S. So yes, she needs to include it as an activity in her other support, but she does not need to include supporting documentation. Next slide, please. All right, last scenario. Dr. Patel has a Dutch doctoral student, Bram Meyer, working in her lab on his dissertation. He's making use of Dr. Patel's facilities, equipment, supplies, personnel, etc. Bram is supported 100% by the University of Amsterdam. Same questions. Does Dr. Patel need to include Bram on her other support? And if yes, does she need to provide supporting documents? All right. Again, the majority of people said yes, that she does need to include him. However, in this case, well, not quite the majority, but more people said no than yes to whether or not she needs to include supporting documents. The correct answer in this case is no. Dr. Patel does not need to include BRAM as an other support resource in her document. And this is, we added the statement here that BRAM is working on his dissertation. And this is probably a type of situation where you would actually want to make sure you had all of the necessary information from the investigator, from Dr. Patel. But in the situation as we've worded it, BRAM is not actually providing any sort of support to Dr. Patel's research endeavors. If anything, it's the other way around. BRAM is mooching off of Dr. Patel. So as the scenario is written here, and unless we had some additional information, BRAM is not a source of support to Dr. Patel's research endeavors, so he would not need to be listed there. Becky.
So I thought any foreign collaboration had to show up on an OS page.
No, and that is something that is a real point of confusion, and it's in part because in the January 2021, I think that date is right. No, 2020, January 2020, effort that U of M undertook to update NIH investigators' other support documentation, we as an institution added a section in our local template that included collaborations, affiliations, and foreign components. And I'm probably
Yes,
wording
that's what I'm
that.
thinking of. Yeah.
Yes. And that is actually not an NIH requirement. That was something that U of M added at that point in time. But in NIH's current version of other support, that information is not included. So
Thank you.
yep, I'm actually really glad you asked that question, because it is a constant point of confusion for many folks out there. So, all right, next slide, please.
Okay, yeah, and thanks for asking. So when I mentioned other support earlier, I just want to take note that on our on ORSP's other support reporting for NIH website that I popped in chat, there is a template on there. So we encourage everybody to begin using this template for NIH investigators. And you'll notice on there are two sections: projects and proposals and in-kind support. Okay, so how can everybody here help? So being a part of this webinar, this is the great first step. Familiarizing yourself with the most recent sponsor requirements and be on the lookout for additional changes. The university will, of course, communicate these changes to the RAs and investigators and update all of the resources and websites. But we are evaluating on a daily basis new frequently asked questions and material and information that we have obtained. So you can also ensure the following when you're working with investigators to get all of their documentation together. Correct sponsor format is being used, including overlap statements. So NIH requires one overlap statement for their other support documents. However, NSF requires an overlap statement for each different project that's included on their current and pending support. We also suggest if there is no overlap, you can simply just state that none of the active pending projects listed above represent an overlap of science budget or committed effort. You can make sure that electronic signature is completed as required. And I know there were a lot of questions in chat about Sign Now and the electronic signature that we'll answer at the end of the webinar. Flatten other support PDFs after signature to meet file size limits, and making sure that supporting documentation is included in other support as needed. Next slide, please. So how are central offices helping? So ORSP staff are reviewing all other support and current and pending support documentations to confirm that no expired projects are listed in the active section. No investigator reports more than 12 calendar months of effort. The completed overlap statements are included on the documentation. There's an investigator signature, and then compliance with other sponsor formatting requirements. So NIH's new formats are being used, et cetera. Next slide, please. So why are COI staff involved? So we are conducting reviews of sponsor documentations, mainly the Biosketch, other support documents, current and pending support, as well as the M-Inform disclosure. So we have this kind of congruency review happening, and you can see that in the picture here at Just in Time and Award for NIH investigators who answered yes to one or more of the international engagement questions on the new signed path activity for all investigators that went into effect in 2020, I believe, late 2020. And then, or for any investigators that disclose an international activity in M-Inform. And this isn't just limited to NIH. We will review other federal sponsors where somebody has said yes to the international engagement questions as well at time of award. Next slide. So what are the possible outcomes of these other support reviews? Could be that there's nothing, right? There are no changes required. We could communicate with an investigator directly for additional information regarding the nature of their international activities. So if we see something disclosed in M-Inform and it's not quite clear, we might reach out to the investigator specifically, just so we have a good understanding of what they're doing, so we can help assist update their sponsor documentation. We'll communicate with investigators and or research administrators to make any necessary updates to said sponsor documentation, including requesting supporting documentations if we need it. And then submission of revised other support or current pending support documentation to federal sponsors if it's required. Currently, NIH and NSF require any previously undisclosed other support information be sent to them within 30 days of us discovering it. Next slide.
All right, so some other words of advice for things that might crop up throughout the life of an award. If you have new sources of active other support, not pending, they should be reported in the annual Research Performance Progress Report, or RPPR. As I mentioned earlier, though, in response to someone's question about RPPRs, we've actually gotten some conflicting information recently from NIH on their expectations for other support at RPPR. So stay tuned for communications or updates, either from us or from NIH on hopefully some clarifying information related to RPPRs. But based on what they have stated in writing, that is what should be included at RPPRs. Also, if you or an investigator discover that there have been previously undisclosed sources of other support that should have been reported at JIT or in an RPPR, but were not. So this is situations not where something new comes along in the course of the award and then you add it on the next RPPR. This is something, let's say, 2 years ago, during the life of the project, it should have been included in your next RPPR, but for whatever reason, it didn't get included, or you left it off of the JIT altogether when you submitted your other support at JIT. In those situations where we discover previously undisclosed other support, we are now required to report it to NIH within 30 days. So if you find yourself in that situation, or one of your investigators finds himself or herself in that situation, please reach out to the other.support.questions@umich.edu email group as soon as you learn about it, and then we will help work with you to figure out what needs to be updated, because bear in mind, depending on the situation, it may not just be the award where you neglected to include it on an RPPR that is impacted. There could be multiple projects for a single investigator that need to be updated. So please reach out to that email address. And like I said, we'll work with you and the investigator to make whatever updates are necessary. And then also obviously work with our colleagues in RSP to get the sponsor updated. Next slide, please. All right. Foreign components. So this is a source of confusion, and this is kind of touching on what Becky Humans was referring to earlier as well. Foreign components are a term of art used by NIH, and NIH's definition of a foreign component is when there's the existence of a significant scientific element or segment of an NIH-funded or proposed project outside of the United States. So it doesn't matter if NIH funds are actually being used in that foreign location, but it is based on the location of where the work is being performed. So NIH does not care if you are actually transferring funds to that foreign location, or they are spending funds on the grant. It's whether or not the work is happening in that location. But keep in mind that work has to be a significant scientific element of the NIH-funded project. So just having an ongoing collaboration or relationship with a colleague in another country doesn't equal a foreign component. Someone in a foreign country needs to actually be executing a significant scientific element of the NIH-funded project, not necessarily using the NIH funds for the project, but the proposed work for the project. So that, of course, all then begs the question, well, what is a significant scientific element of a project? And some examples that NIH has provided that might indicate that a significant scientific element is included are the involvement of human subjects or animal subjects at the foreign location, extensive foreign travel by recipient project staff for the purposes of data collection, surveying, or sampling, collaborations with investigators at a foreign site anticipated to result in a co-authorship, use of facilities or instrumentation at that foreign site. And the rule of thumb that I advise people to kind of think about also is look at the specific aims in the proposed project or the funded project. If one or more of those specific aims could not be carried out without the work that's being done at that foreign location, you might have a foreign component, or at least really give it some thought. Next slide, please. And so what is important about foreign components? Well, the biggest thing is that prior approval is required for foreign components from NIH. So during the proposal process, when you're filling out your path, make sure you've answered yes to question 5.13, which is that laundry list of all of the various research activities that are happening as part of the proposed project. There is a new-ish one, it's been around for a little while now, but question 5.13, which asks about international collaboration. I can't remember the exact wording, but you want to make sure that you've answered yes to that question, and then also answered yes to question 6, 6A, and 6B on your actual 424 proposal. If for some reason you realize that you need to request a foreign component on an already awarded project, sort of midstream, then you're going to want to submit an award change request, an ACR, through ERPM in order to do that. And just a reminder, and this goes exactly to what the question that Becky raised a few minutes ago, do not include foreign components in other support. Foreign components are project specific. Next slide, please. Okay, so briefly, what about all of the other sponsors out there besides NIH? The good news is that generally, if you're in compliance with NIH's requirements, you will be compliant with other sponsors like NSF. However, some things to keep in mind. only NIH currently requires supporting documentation, which is a good thing. So contracts, agreements, those kinds of things, only NIH is requiring that those be submitted along with other support. Only NIH currently requires electronic signature, also a good thing. NSF, however, does require overlap statements for each project in the current and pending document. So on the NIH other support, there's a single statement at the bottom of the document for the investigator to say there is or is not any overlap. If there is overlap, give some more information about it, and then they provide their electronic signature. NSF has that overlap statement on a project by project basis in the current and pending document. Also, for those of you who may be submitting to DARPA, just something to be aware of, that DARPA has recently released a risk matrix to try to better assess the potential for undue foreign influence or conflicts of interest and conflicts of commitment. We're not really sure where this is going at this point, but they have indicated that they are using it as an assessment tool in their proposal review process. So that's something you might want to have on your radar. And then I think April's going to touch on this also in our resources slide, but there is a new disclosure matrix tool that we've developed specifically for here at U of M that provides more information on all the different types of information that an investigator may be involved with, and then where they need to disclose that, including M-Inform, the Biosketch, OtherSupport, etc. So that's a very helpful tool. Next slide, please. And then very quickly, what do we see coming down the pike? Well, no one has a crystal ball, but be aware that this whole topic of international engagement is still very fluid. We expect that there will be more changes coming, so keep your eyes and ears open. The biggest thing that is coming up on the horizon is back at the end of the Trump administration, they released the National Security Presidential Memorandum 33, NSPM 33, which has now been followed up with guidance from the Office of Science and Technology Policy, OSTP. Just a couple months ago now, in January, OSTP released their guidance, and that's really guidance intended for the federal sponsor agencies on what the federal expectations are to be as diligent and secure in this area as possible. There will likely be some impacts even further downstream for recipient institutions like U of M. But again, that guidance is really aimed at the federal agencies that are sponsoring research, not as much at recipient institutions. That's not entirely 100% true, but for the most part. And we do expect, as a result of that guidance, the OSTP guidance, we expect there to potentially be changes coming from other agencies, but what we've heard from both NIH and NSF at this point is they feel like they've pretty much already implemented the changes that are being recommended through the NSPM 33 guidance. So we don't expect a lot more wholesale change from NIH and NSF, hopefully just additional clarifications, please. As always, keep in mind that, the world keeps turning. Current events don't stop happening. And this current situation in Ukraine is a good example of that. So just keep your ear to the ground, so to speak, and be aware that more changes may be coming. Next slide, please.
So hopefully we have been able to clarify and not confuse you too much. However, if you need help, please reach out. We are here to support you. The COI staff at coi.support@umich.edu can help with M-Inform disclosures, provide one-on-one consultations. Office hours will be happening in July for the next disclosure cycle, or general questions about on-site activities or potential conflicts of interest. There's an OtherSupport review team, again, other.support.questions@umich.edu. Happy to help with any proposal documentation, just-in-time materials, RPPRs, or previously undisclosed other support. When in doubt, if you're not really sure, we would encourage you to encourage the investigator to disclose and report it. And again, when in doubt, reach out. Either your email address or office can help connect you with the right resource. Next slide, please. And speaking of resources, we have a bunch on our websites, ORSP and COI sites. The disclosure matrix and the outside activity disclosure guidance are two really great, helpful resources that you should check out. We also have NIH OtherSupport reporting and Biosketch websites that have checklists, templates, and examples. We have an NSF, current and pending support, and Biosketch webpage. Medical school specifically has an OtherSupport resources site. COI has an OtherSupport review process. So if you had any questions about what we're doing or why we're involved, you can check that out there. And then again, emailing questions to us.